So, today we're going to talk about moral responsibility and what are called reactive attitudes, and in particular, what are sometimes called reactive attitude theories of moral responsibility. So, we're coming off of the last lecture that was basically about the connection between moral responsibility and free will, and then in particular, whether or not this principle, PAP, the principle of alternative possibilities, is true, why people think it's true, why it's important to the free will and moral responsibility debate, in particular why it's important for questions about determinism and whether determinism threatens free will. And then we saw some common objections, a famous objection to PAP, which is in the Frankfurt cases. Harry Frankfurt came up with these cases where he thought you could show that a person could be morally responsible for what they did, meaning that they exercised at least some sufficient amount of control in order to be morally responsible, even though the claim is they couldn't have done otherwise, right? And so we saw this connection between moral responsibility and alternative possibilities. Excuse me. And so now today we're going to talk about the connection between moral responsibility and what Peter Strawson called the reactive attitudes. And this is important because one of the upshots of this view, as we'll see, is supposed to be that, again, alternative possibilities, having the ability to do otherwise, doesn't matter. It's not required for free will. Or I should say, sorry, it's not required for moral responsibility, at least. So the Strawson stuff that we'll talk about today, and often a lot of the stuff that we talked about last time with alternative possibilities and the Frankfurt cases, and PAP in particular, gets talked about in terms of moral responsibility, and the view that we'll talk about today certainly does as well. But obviously free will is sort of connected with all that anyways. But what we'll see is that Peter Strawson, who is the father of Galen Strawson, so we saw the basic argument for skepticism a few weeks ago, and that was from Galen Strawson, who argued that nobody can be responsible because that means you have to create yourself. This is Peter Strawson. This is his dad, who was not an impossibilist, who was a compatibilist about moral responsibility. He thought moral responsibility is compatible with determinism. Determinism does not eliminate moral responsibility. But the way in which he did that, he does that by not through the Frankfurt cases, not that kind of style, but it's as we'll see, and we'll get into that right now. He brought the concept of moral responsibility sort of into our practices. Well, he grounded it in our practices. So, okay, so let's look at Strawson. So he had this famous paper in 1962 called Freedom and Resentment. And what he did, the way I put it here is he brought the issue of free will, moral responsibility, and basically the issue that we started with at the beginning of class. Is determinism a problem for free will? Can we have free will in a deterministic world? He thought that question is kind of silly the way it's asked. Can we be morally responsible? Would it be okay to hold people responsible, to have certain blaming attitudes towards people, if we found out that some sort of abstract, esoteric, kind of technical, metaphysical thesis was true about the world and the nature of the laws, that we do a bunch of philosophy and maybe some physics, and we find out that the world is deterministic? He thought, he basically thought, I have no idea why we're talking about this. This just doesn't matter to free will and responsibility. So that sounds a little odd. That's a very different approach than we've seen before. So what is he doing here? Why does he think that thinking about determinism is just irrelevant to thinking about responsibility? Well, he brings this issue of whether we have free will and responsibility down to earth in the sense that he thinks that the important question is, what are our responsibility practices like? Our ordinary human practices of holding people responsible, right? What are those like? So free will, he thought, is just about when it's appropriate to hold each other responsible, right? So we saw this really tight connection last week between free will and responsibility, right? People thought moral responsibility requires free will. You can't be responsible unless you acted freely. And Strawson thinks there's something right about that. There is something right about that. The question of free will, do we have free will? Does determinism undermine free will? What kinds of things, if not determinism, excuse responsibility or mean that someone didn't act rightly? Didn't act within their control. What kinds of things count here? These free will questions are just questions about, at least they're geared towards or aimed towards, figuring out when it's appropriate to hold each other responsible, when it's appropriate to blame each other or praise each other, right? And for us, so he keeps kind of this connection. Free will is tightly connected to responsibility because we, as I put it last week, we only care about free will insofar as we care about responsibility. We only care about if somebody's free because we care about whether it's appropriate to blame them or not, how we should treat them when they do things that we take to be wrong, or maybe in things that we take to be right. Okay, so it is connected. Now, he thought for us, and that means humans, for human beings, holding someone responsible is really just about treating them in a certain way. And sort of more specifically, it's about being disposed or being ready to treat them in certain ways, right? So maybe being disposed or even actually taking action against them, like punishing them, putting them in prison, or maybe rewarding them, giving them gifts or praise or whatever. But the sort of more important thing for him that is fundamentally being ready to treat someone in certain ways is really fundamentally about adopting a certain attitude towards them. Okay, it's about adopting what he called reactive attitudes towards another person. And the reactive attitudes, because these attitudes come up, we take up these attitudes in reaction or in response to things that people do. And as we'll see down below, it's not just to things people do, it's to what those things that they do express about them and their character. Kind of like your actions signaling something about who you are, at least in that moment of acting. And we'll see that below. But the point here is just, look, he says, free will, let's think about our practices. If we're thinking about when it's appropriate to hold people responsible and whether they're free, well, let's just look at our practices about this stuff. What do we actually do when we're thinking about whether someone's free and whether we should hold them responsible? Right? And for us, that comes to when we think about when we should hold someone responsible, what we're thinking about is not just punishing and rewarding them, but fundamentally, because this happens even when this happens, right? So fundamentally, it's about when it's appropriate to hold some attitude towards them, to take up some responsive or reactive attitude towards the person in question. Okay, so being morally responsible then just amounts to being an appropriate target of those attitudes. We take up certain attitudes towards people. We take up an attitude of blaming, and maybe that can be broken down further. We take up this attitude of resentment towards them, or we get indignant towards them. Or maybe on the other side, we feel admiration or gratitude towards someone when they do something for us or they do something nice, right? These attitudes of feeling guilty, that's kind of taking an attitude towards yourself, of a blaming attitude towards yourself. Forgiving, right? It's taking a kind of excusing attitude towards someone. Sometimes, anyways, I guess not necessarily. But the point is, we have these attitudes, and these attitudes are fundamentally tied up in our moral responsibility practices. The sort of principles that we use and the sort of actions that we take to be appropriate and inappropriate are just kind of a part of this moral community that we're a part of as people that interact with each other. And so these reactive attitudes are really just kind of natural things that we do as humans. And if we look at the ways in which we express those reactive attitudes, and we're wondering about free will and responsibility, what Strawson wants to say is what it is to be morally responsible just amounts to being an appropriate or fitting target of those attitudes. That's what it is. That's when we look at our practices, that's what it means to be responsible. When is someone responsible? Well, when it's appropriate within some moral community, some community of moral responsibility practices, when it's appropriate in that community to hold them responsible, to hold them to account for what they did by, at the very minimum, taking up one of these reactive attitudes towards them. So when someone does something wrong, just sort of naturally, automatically even, we respond, and when we even think about cases, when we think about these hypothetical cases of wrongdoers or serial killers or whatever else, or really, well-accomplished, admirable people like a Mother Teresa or a Gandhi or maybe an Olympic athlete or something. We take up these attitudes of admiration, right? And these attitudes, when they're appropriately targeted at someone, that's what it means for that person to be responsible. Okay. And Strawson thought, where else should we be looking other than our practices? If free will is about appropriately holding each other responsible, well, and for humans to do that means to be sort of disposed to treat them in certain ways. Well, part of being disposed to treat them in certain ways is just having these attitudes come up towards them. I mean, we're kind of disposed to have these attitudes come up, but what it means to have these attitudes, to take up a reactive attitude towards someone, that you just are disposed. When you do that, you just are disposed to treat them in certain ways, right? If they just, start doing things normal, somebody does wrongs you or something, and then they just don't even acknowledge it, and they keep continuing to treat you like everything's normal, you're going to be disposed to react to that. You're going to maybe bring it up and say, what the heck? You're not even acknowledging what you did. Or maybe you'll just be disposed to not even want to be around them anymore or ignore them if they ask you for things. That kind of, in a way, I mean, there's lots of debates about what the reactive attitudes are, but just sort of intuitively, we can think of being disposed to treat them in that kind of a way. That just means you just do have this reactive attitude of blame towards them. That's sort of why you're disposed to treat them that way. And you might even think that just is what it is to have a blaming attitude towards someone, to be disposed to treat them in certain ways that are correlated with that particular attitude, right? If you're disposed to treat them in gracious ways, right, or thankful ways, you might have a gratitude attitude towards them, a grateful attitude, a gratitude, right? So the point is here that Strawson brought the question of free will and responsibility down to earth, down to our practices in the following sense. That he thought, because of a couple intuitive conceptual connections, the way in which, what it means to be morally responsible is just about being the appropriate target of these reactive attitudes, okay, within some moral community. Okay, so being morally responsible then is going to involve being a part of some moral community, or what Kane called a form of life. I'm not sure if that's a Strawsonian term, but where when you're responsible for something, you're going to be an appropriate target of these attitudes. But what that means is that there is a moral community that the person being responsible and the person holding them responsible are a part of. And that community is one in which it is appropriate to do the things they're doing, to hold the person responsible when they act that way. Okay. That's where the attitudes, that's where the variations in attitudes and the variations in appropriateness of having those attitudes or not, that's where it comes from. It comes from the norms of the moral community. Okay, so Strawsonian moral responsibility. Okay, this concept, this understanding, this conception of moral responsibility that comes from Strawson's work, in Freedom and Resentment, originally at least, is this idea that some agent is morally responsible for some action. Okay, S is morally responsible for A, if and only if. Remember our if and only if. It's a two-sided conditional. It's a biconditional. It means this side is true every time this side is true. And the other way. If this side is true, then that means this side is true. So the two sides are true, always true together, or they're false together. Okay, they can't be one true, one false. They're either false together or they're true together. So every time you get one, you get the other one, right? So what it means for someone to be, and you use if and only if, just a reminder, use if and only if, usually when you do definitions, it's called necessary and sufficient conditions, but basically what that means is you're taking this concept here to be fully fleshed out by this over here. Okay, so every time you get someone being responsible for something, it's going to be true that that person's an appropriate target of the reactive attitudes for doing that thing, right? Not for doing something else, obviously. And anytime someone is an appropriate target of the reactive attitudes for doing some action, that's just what it means for them to be morally responsible for that action. Okay, so I want to repeat that because it's very important. You ask this question, What does it mean for someone to be morally responsible for some action? That means that that person is an appropriate target of the reactive attitudes, of some reactive attitude for doing that action. Okay. And the other way, which is very important to understand, anytime it's true that someone is an appropriate target of the reactive attitudes, according to some moral community, that'll come up later, and they're an appropriate target of the reactive attitudes for doing some action, that's just what it means. That's just what it is for someone to be morally responsible for that action. That's what it means. Okay? So that is Straussian moral responsibility. All right. So now, moral responsibility then, this idea, what's unique about this idea is not that moral responsibility is connected to our practices. Or in particular, it's not that moral responsibility is connected to the reactive attitudes of like resentment, and anger, and gratitude, and blaming, and guilt, and forgiveness, and all these things. Of course, our reactive attitudes are connected to responsibility, right? We take ourselves to sort of be responding to someone being responsible, right? But what was kind of novel, or what was in fact novel about Strawson's view, and the kind of issue we're going to focus on, is not, he didn't just say that moral responsibility involves the reactive attitudes, or the moral responsibility, the idea of being morally responsible, and the idea that we have these attitudes that we take towards people. He's not just saying that they're connected, that they're related to each other, that they're within the same topic, that they're in the same ballpark. He's not just saying that. Of course, he is saying that, but other people knew that already. What he's saying is moral responsibility is being the appropriate target of reactive attitudes. It's constituted by it. Okay, it consists in nothing. To be morally responsible just consists in being an appropriate target of the reactive attitudes. That was the new thing. Okay, so obviously other people knew it was related, right? But he really tied them together, conceptually tied them together. This kind of tagline here is the way in which it kind of gets described sometimes. To be morally responsible is just to be appropriately held morally responsible. So to be morally responsible is to be held morally responsible. Okay. This reverses the standard order, because what we might originally think is appropriately holding someone morally responsible gets determined by, I should just use this, sorry. Being appropriately held morally responsible is determined by actually being morally responsible, right? What does it mean to appropriately hold someone responsible? Well, that depends on when someone actually is responsible. And then we need to figure out what it means for someone to be responsible, right? How do we know when we're appropriately blaming someone? Okay, well, they actually have to be responsible. So we need to figure out when they're responsible. And this is where free will comes in, like, well, they need to control themselves and all these different things. And that was the connection we saw last week. Moral responsibility requires free will, right? That's the idea. Why? Because the question is, when is it appropriate? When is it okay to hold someone responsible, to blame them? Well, they need to be free, right? They need, and in order to be responsible, you have to actually be free. But what Strawson's doing here is kind of flipping the order. He's not saying, in order to figure out when it's okay to hold someone responsible, we need to determine when they're responsible, when they're actually responsible. He's saying what it means, or what determines whether someone is actually responsible, is just when it's appropriate to hold them responsible, according to some moral community. So it kind of flips the order here. All right? And that's important. We'll come back to that. So what justifies or makes it appropriate to hold someone responsible is, again, just the community that you're a part of. Okay? So we have this idea that the question, when is someone morally responsible? And he says, whenever it's appropriate to hold them responsible. Whenever they're an appropriate target of these reactive attitudes. Well, then you might ask, when is that appropriate? When is it appropriate to have these reactive attitudes towards someone? It says, whenever it's appropriate according to the moral community that you're a part of. All right, so we'll try to illustrate this. You have some person, they do some action, right? Someone does this action A. Well, then somebody else holds them responsible. They get this reactive attitude of blaming or resentment or something like that, and it's kind of shining on this person, right? This reactive attitude is directed at this person for doing this action. Okay, this is what it means, at least in part, to hold someone responsible, is to form this reactive attitude, to take up this reactive attitude, and let's just call it some blaming reactive attitude. You take this attitude up towards this person. It's directed at this person for doing some action. Okay. That is what it is to sort of hold someone responsible, to take up the reactive attitude towards them. But the question is, when is this appropriate? You might do this in the wrong context or something. When is this appropriate? Well, then you have this moral community that S1 and S2, that these two people are a part of, right? And this moral community has certain norms. Let's call the moral community X. Well, here's the practices in X. They think, hey, A is wrong. Blaming people for doing A is appropriate. Like taking up this blaming attitude, that's appropriate because it's wrong, and maybe because there's some conditions that excuse or mitigate responsibility, but maybe none of them were met here. This person's not a child. They're not severely cognitively disabled or anything like that. They're not drugged or brainwashed. So, and then of course you might have this list might continue on and on and on and on and on. There might be lots of different practices within X, this moral community. And we'll get to this point later, but this moral community is typically supposed to be the moral community of humans, not like society to society. But we'll come back to that. The point for now is if what it means for someone to be responsible is to be an appropriate target of the reactive attitudes, then we need to ask, when is it appropriate to have the reactive attitudes towards people? Well, Strawson says this reactive attitude situation, having a reactive attitude towards someone for doing something, is made appropriate or is justified by the moral practice of which you are a part. Okay. It's according to these practices. And I should say, Strawson doesn't think that like these people got together, a bunch of adults got together and they got in a boardroom and they like wrote down all the rules they're following. It's not really like that. It's more like this really, really fundamental and natural way in which we treat each other, morally speaking. The way in which we see each other as moral agents, and the way in which we expect things from others as moral agents that we know understand the fact that they're a part of a moral community, that we know that they understand reasons, or at least we assume that. And once we figure out that they don't have these sort of ordinary capacities, then we'll modify our behaviors, right? We'll modify our attitudes. But the default assumption is that there's this fundamental way in which people interact with each other as moral agents. Right? Just human moral interaction. And we get, Strawson thinks, we get some sort of fundamental rules about when it's appropriate to take up attitudes towards someone for their behavior. We just kind of get those for free as part of being human and part of having this moral community aspect to our interactive social lives. Okay, so that's what justifies the appropriateness of the reactive attitudes, is the practices, the moral community. And again, it's supposed to be sort of human-based and not like America-based or something like that. All right, what does this mean for determinism? So, just like Frankfurt tried to say, hey, we don't need alternative possibilities. We don't need to worry about whether or not we could do otherwise. And like last week, one of the upshots of that sort of position, saying we don't need to worry about alternative possibilities, denying PAP, one of the upshots is that you don't have to worry about determinism. Because mainly the problem with determinism is supposed to be that it takes away our ability to do otherwise. But if you don't require the ability to do otherwise in order to be responsible, then you're just not going to care about determinism. Okay, so you're going to get a similar move here. You're going to get a similar result, I should say, that we're not going to care about determinism. That's going to be the main issue. How does this affect determinism? How does determinism fit in? Well, in Strawson's view, we don't have to care about it anymore. But it's not because of Frankfurt cases. It's not directing an argument towards PAP. Right? What it's doing is looking to the practices. Okay, so the original worry, again, is determinism destroys free will and responsibility, okay, making it inappropriate to hold people responsible because it rules out the ability to do otherwise. And a lot of people thought you need the ability to do otherwise if you're going to be responsible and free. Well, Strawson says, let's ask, does determinism destroy free will and responsibility? Does determinism make it inappropriate to hold people responsible? Or would determinism make it inappropriate? And he says, let's see. How do we figure that out? We look to the practices. Why? Because of what we just said. Responsibility is grounded in our practices. Okay, so being morally responsible is grounded in our practices of holding each other responsible. Determinism doesn't matter there. If we look to our practices, it's not like we're walking around going, should I blame that person for cutting in front of me in line? I don't know. Is determinism true? Clearly, we're not thinking about that. Right? And you might think, well, we do think about the ability to do otherwise, and we'll get to that. But the point for now is just we just don't think about this really global sort of philosophical, metaphysical problem of determinism in our ordinary practices. We have independent reasons that are internal to our practices for when we want to not hold people responsible. Right? We don't need determinism. Global metaphysical questions about determinism and so on, those are just external to our practices. Those are things that philosophers came up with so that they can wonder abstractly and philosophically whether anyone could ever be free and whether it's even possible to be free and responsible. And Strawson thinks, it's a little interpretive now, but Strawson thinks that this is just silly. He thinks it's just really silly to think about these global metaphysical questions if what we're interested in is whether or not it's appropriate to hold each other responsible. He's like, look, we have practices about this stuff. Why aren't we just looking to our practices that tell us naturally, sort of intuitively, not just intuitively in our own minds, but if we just look around at the way in which we treat each other, and there are instincts about when to treat each other in certain ways, we can see that we have some pretty sort of fundamental things going on here that he's probably going to want to say are universal across at least most cultures. And determinism just doesn't have anything to do with that. There are internal reasons to the practices. Things like being a child, right? Which has nothing to do with determinism. So since we already have internal reasons for withholding reactive attitudes, we just don't need determinism. We don't think about that, right? So that's the idea. Moreover, adding to this, Strawson says, even if we wanted to, we couldn't give up our reactive attitudes. We couldn't give up our moral responsibility practices and be skeptics. We can't just think no one's responsible. We can't do that, right? And Smolansky, as we saw from the Skepticism Week, he kind of agrees with this. He thinks Strawson's right that we can't just teach people an argument for skepticism. We can't just say, hey, look, here's this philosophical argument to show that no one's responsible, especially if it starts with determinism being true. And then everyone's going to go, oh, okay, I get it. No one's responsible. Sweet. I'm not going to be resentful anymore. I'm not going to blame anyone anymore. I'm not going to feel guilty anymore for the things that I do that I think might be bad. That's just not going to happen. Even if we knew determinism was true, we couldn't stop our reactive attitudes. It's literally like psychologically impossible, he thought. And again, Smolansky kind of agrees. And Smolansky disagrees with the conclusion. Smolansky doesn't think that we're free or responsible, but there is this commonality between them that, as Strawson says, it's just psychologically impossible for us to not have these attitudes towards people. So we can't abandon them even if we tried. Moreover, part of the reason that Strawson thinks the practice, our moral practices, and again, in particular, more generally, our human moral practices of interacting with each other and holding each other responsible, part of the reason that justifies holding people responsible, having the attitudes towards them, part of the reason is that these practices fulfill fundamental human needs. Fundamental human needs about social interaction. We're social creatures, right? This is kind of a fundamental piece. It's a foundational brick in this world, this social world that we build. We really couldn't have the social world as we know it in interacting with each other in the way that we do as moral agents and seeing other people as moral agents, we just couldn't have that without some kind of moral responsibility practice. And again, that is very much Smolansky's idea as well. That's why he has the solution that he has to try to combine the two views in I can't remember the name of it. Fundamental Dualism, I think was the name of it. That's why he has that solution, is because he also thinks that this practice of holding each other responsible and taking up these attitudes is really, really fundamental for humans. It's just sort of part of what makes us able to have a society. And so not only is it kind of psychologically impossible for us to get rid of these attitudes and to get rid of these practices altogether, but it's irrational. I mean, we'd kind of be destroying something fundamental to having a sort of operative human society. Okay, so the reactive attitudes are here to stay. Okay. So this worry about determinism, this idea that we could think about this abstract philosophical idea and it's going to make us get rid of our moral responsibility practices. That's, again, like I just see Strawson as thinking about this and saying, what a silly idea that is. So that's kind of the idea there. And again, the final note here is I want to reemphasize, I know I said this, but Strawson is not really saying it's about our responsibility practices in terms of being Americans. He was not American, he was British, but or Westerners or whatever. It's not like social practices in a society-based sense. At least it's not supposed to be. It's really supposed to be kind of human practices. Ordinary reactive attitudes, ordinary moral responsibility practices, that's supposed to mean human, not necessarily. So he's not necessarily trying to be a cultural relativist, where it's like, okay, what are the practices in the United States? What are the practices in Sudan? What are the practices in Australia, Japan, Russia, whatever? And then according to those countries or societies, then it's okay to have the attitude here and hold someone responsible, but not okay over here. It's not supposed to be like that. Okay, it's our nature that does it, our history, evolutionary history as human beings. Right? So it's more general than that, which is supposed to hopefully give us a more fundamental basis for this view. Okay. Now, I guess quick recap. Strawson brings the issue down to our practices, the issue of free will and responsibility, because being free is just about when to hold each other responsible, and where else should we look than just our practices as human beings? Again, not our sort of immediate social practices in our immediate community, but the moral community as a whole for humans. And it's part of our nature to be this way. And so moral responsibility, if it's about being an appropriate target of these natural human reactive attitudes, well, then what it is to be responsible just is to be an appropriate target of those attitudes. And therefore, responsibility is not just involved with these attitudes, it is fundamentally being a target of these attitudes. It's constituted by that. And what justifies that? Being an appropriate target, what makes that appropriate? This moral community that you're a part of. And its practices about when to hold people responsible and when not to. Okay. All right. So, Strawson was very influential with this paper. Everyone was kind of debating determinism. Is determinism the boogeyman? What should we do? Oh my gosh, determinism. And then Strawson comes along and says, this is just silly. What are you guys talking about? Who cares about determinism? We've never really thought of this in any ordinary sense of thinking about whether someone's free and responsible. This is an abstract, esoteric, technical, made-up, philosophical problem. We need to think about responsibility in terms of our actual responsibility practices. Okay, and some people, he didn't say a lot about this last part, right? And so he didn't say a lot about this here, what actually are our practices, and if they differ from culture to culture, what does that mean, right? Is that a problem? Is there some fundamental stuff that's supposed to be universal, even though some of the specifics differ? What is the idea there? So then some people came along and tried to help sort of bolster his view, this reactive attitudes-based view. Okay, they liked the idea, and they wanted to sort of help it out and give it a little bit more solid foundation. And so R.J. Wallace is one person who came in and tried to help with this, and he focused a lot on emotions and sentiments and the reactive, trying to understand the nature of reactive attitudes in particular. And he was, I believe, at I think he was at UC Riverside, if I'm not mistaken. Up till recently, I didn't even still be emeritus there. Or emeritus. So, all right, R.J. Wallace focuses on the emotions, reactive attitudes, but in particular for this chapter from Kane, what we're going to focus on is he tries to figure out when we actually excuse people and what it means according to our practices when we say someone's excused or exempted or something from blame. All right, so he thought, let's try to figure out sort of more specifically what goes on when we excuse people so that we can really do a good job showing that determinism is really not a problem. Okay. So despite appearances, you might think determinism, we do think about determinism, but he's like, look, despite appearances, determinism is not really what undermines responsibility in our practices. Because you might think, hey, we often excuse people when they couldn't help it, right? We say things like, well, Joe couldn't have done otherwise, right? It wasn't possible for Joe to fulfill that request, and therefore we shouldn't blame him for it, right? So, I mean, if somebody couldn't help it, if they couldn't do otherwise, these kinds of things, if they lacked the capacity, we talk this way, and we think this excuses people. So isn't determinism a problem then? Because determinism makes it so that you can't help what you do, you can't do otherwise. And basically Wallace says not really. I mean, of course, sometimes when we excuse people, it's also true that they couldn't help it, that they couldn't do otherwise. But that's not really the reason why we're excusing them. It's not because we thought about this global, metaphysical, philosophical problem, and then we thought, oh, like, here's this argument from Galen Strawson about why we can't be responsible, or, hey, here's this, hard determinist argument from Ted Hundrick or whatever. We don't do that. It's not this global metaphysical idea of determinism that really excuses people, right? And he says, also, if we look closer at our practices, sure, sometimes like we excuse people and it seems like we excuse them because we couldn't help it, but really that's not what's going on. And if we look at our practices, we'll see that the ability to do otherwise is not required. It's not required for the ability to do otherwise in our practices, right? Okay. Why? Well, excusing people is really about whether they chose to do what they did, whether they deliberately chose to do what they did, not whether they could have done otherwise. It's not about determinism. It's not like, oh, determinism is true and they couldn't do otherwise. No, we excuse people based on whether their choice was genuine, purposeful, intentional, up to them, reflective of their own deliberative process, understanding the reasons, and making an informed choice. That's what we care about. So Kane gives us an example. Suppose Molly is waiting to go to a party, and according to her, John is supposed to pick her up. Okay, maybe Molly and John talked about this party, and they're like, oh yeah, we should both go. And then Molly calls John, leaves a message on his voicemail, and says, hey, why don't you just pick me up on your way to the party? And I'll be just getting off work or whatever. Come by and pick me up, and we'll go together. And so she gets off work, and she's waiting for John to pick him up. Well, John never picks her up. He doesn't show up. And Molly says, maybe makes her way to the party and sees him there and says, what the heck, John? You were supposed to pick me up. I don't understand. And has this kind of blaming attitude, right? Takes up this reactive attitude towards John. Is maybe a little indignant, at least blameful towards him, right? And John says, whoa, what do you mean? I had no idea I was supposed to pick you up. I know we talked about going to this party together. Not going together, but I know we talked about that we were both going to go to this party and all that. But you never told me to pick you up. I never knew I was going to pick you up. And Molly says, I left a voicemail. I left a message on your phone at home. I should say, for you young people, there used to be this thing called a house phone, and people would call it, and it was connected to the land. It was called a landline. It was in your house, and it didn't move anywhere. And then you had this tape that you would put in it, and it would record messages that people would leave. Okay, I'm being a little facetious, but the example uses a house phone, yes, and not a cellular phone. So that's why John didn't know, because he didn't go home and listen to his messages like people used to do. He didn't go home, and so he had no idea Molly was supposed to pick him up. Okay, so what Kane says is, what Wallace thinks, what Kane says Wallace is going to say here is that Molly should lose her reactive attitude. If she had this blaming attitude towards him, because she initially thought, well, of course he heard my message and then he just ignored it or something, or he didn't care. Of course, yeah, that's really mean and so on, and maybe he deserved blame for that. But that's not what happened. And John explains that. I never went home. I came to the party straight from work. I never made it home. I didn't hear your message. And Molly should go, oh, okay, I'm sorry. Maybe I should have called your cell phone, or maybe I should have double-checked with you yesterday. And he's now going to be excused, right? And it's not because he couldn't have done otherwise. We can assume determinism is true. And Wallace is like, that's not what's excusing it here, right? And we can also not assume that. Maybe he could have gone home. Who knows, right? Doesn't matter. That's not the reason why he's excused. It's not because he couldn't do otherwise. He's excused because he didn't make the choice not to pick her up. As far as he knew, that wasn't even a choice, right? He didn't even think about that because he didn't know he had that obligation. He didn't think he had that obligation, right? He didn't do anything really negligent here. Like, he just got off work and went to the party, and he thought Molly was going to be there. And he's excused because he didn't deliberately choose it. He didn't do it on purpose. She's like, you're blameworthy for leaving me at work and not coming to get me. And he explains what happened, and she goes, okay, I see. It was an accident. Not even really an accident, right? It was just like, you didn't even know I was waiting for you. So obviously you didn't leave me on purpose. You didn't even know about it, right? So that's what is excusing him, is the fact that he didn't deliberately choose to leave her there. He didn't do it. He would not be excused if he heard the message and was like, forget Molly. She's annoying. I'm not going to pick her up. Okay, then that's a different story, right? Then he deliberately chose it, right? Even if he couldn't have done otherwise, Wallace wants to say, he still wouldn't have been excused because now he's making basically a deliberate choice based on on sufficient information and everything. And so that choice is going to be reflective of him and his deliberative processes. And it's going to be something that he did with all the information, not incompetent, right? Not incapacitated in any way or incoherent or anything intoxicated. Nothing's going on. Just normal deliberative processes, and he chooses not to, right? So again, the point here is that it just doesn't have anything to do with, excuse me, with the ability to do otherwise. Right? So being an appropriate target of the reactive attitudes is about how your actions reflect your quality of will. Okay, so this is what all this stuff is getting at. Why is it not about the ability to do otherwise? It's about him deliberately choosing or not. That's what excuses him. He didn't deliberately choose to leave Molly, right? Why? What does that tell us? It tells us that appropriate reactive attitudes are targeting quality of will. And when a certain quality of will is there, basically quality of will means what's your intention, your will. It's like, what's your intention towards someone when you act? When you knock the glass over, what was your intention there? Was it on purpose? Was it malicious? Was it a joke? Was it completely accidental? You didn't see it? Did somebody push you and you bumped into it? Right? That question is about what is your motive here? What's your intention? What's the quality of your will expressed in your action? That is what appropriate reactive attitudes target. It would be inappropriate for Molly to blame John, Because he didn't have ill will. Right? His action did not express ill will towards Molly. It did not express a deliberate choice to leave her there. It didn't express goodwill either, right? And that's fine. Some of our actions don't have to express goodwill in order to not be blameworthy, right? They just might be neutral. It's just like accident. If I accidentally knock your glass over, it's not expressing any goodwill. But the important thing is that it's not expressing any ill will either, right? And a negative reactive attitude, a blaming reactive attitude, if it's appropriate, is targeting some appropriate quality of will that it's supposed to match up with, right? Are they acting from goodwill or ill will, right? So reactive attitudes respond to the way that our actions express our will. Okay, what's the nature of our intention? Do we do it on purpose? Do we mean to do it? Do we choose it reflectively based on the reasons? Remember, John is excused because he didn't mean it. He didn't mean to leave her there. He didn't do it on purpose. He didn't even choose it. He didn't even know, right? And this is about what his will was like, the quality of his will, roughly understood as the nature of his intentions or his motives, right? His action did not express any ill will, and that is what is important. That's what makes it inappropriate for Molly to blame him. Okay, so now let's just represent this. You have someone doing something with ill will, and say just making them red like they did it maliciously, right? Let's say this person, again, like knocks over a glass or leaves a friend. I should describe it differently. Doesn't pick up a friend at the airport, let's say. And this person, same thing, knocks over a glass, doesn't pick a friend up at the airport. But the question is, are they morally responsible for that? They perform the same action, right? And you can think of this as two people or just the same person in a different scenario. This person does this action with no ill will here. That's why he's green, right? Maybe he does it accidentally, right? Maybe he's taken away by some car wreck and he's like the only person around that knows he's an EMT or something off duty, and he stops to help. And so he's going to be, doesn't pick you up at the airport when he said. There's all kinds of things that might make it so that they perform this action without any ill will. And maybe in that case, with goodwill. And then you can have someone who performs the same action, but does it with ill will, maliciously wants to harm somebody, right? So then if someone takes up a blaming attitude towards these people, the blaming attitude is not going to match in this case, where they don't have any ill will. Or maybe they even have goodwill. It doesn't match. If they took up like a forgiving attitude, right? I made the attitude red because it's a blaming attitude. Right? But if they had like a forgiving attitude or a grateful attitude, that also wouldn't really match, especially if they did it on accident. But in this case, where their action does express ill will. It expresses something about this person, that they did it with ill will. And then the blaming attitude does match. Okay, so this is just to express the idea that our reactive attitudes, appropriate reactive attitudes, target an appropriate quality of will. And so this reactive attitude is inappropriate because it's not targeting the right quality of will. A blaming attitude is supposed to be targeting ill will, like this one. And so this one does not match. Okay, so that's part of what it is to make someone responsible, is not just that they're the fitting target of the reactive attitude, but part of what that means is that to be a fitting target of the reactive attitude is that the reactive attitude kind of matches up with or is reactive to some quality of will. Okay, and when those things match, then that's good. Okay, quality of will is also about this ability for reflective self-control. Okay, so when we say that someone acts with ill will, or that they act with goodwill, or they act with no ill will, right? What we're saying, according to Wallace, is that the person does or doesn't act from this ability to reflectively self-control themselves, to control themselves. Sorry, that they act with this ability or reflective self-control. This ability to understand reasons for their actions and then apply those reasons. So not only recognize that there's a reason not to do what they did, right? Did they understand what they were doing was wrong? Did they understand that it was going to harm the person? But it's not only the ability to recognize or grasp certain moral reasons, but also to make those reasons applicable, to apply them in your actions, to act for those reasons. Okay, some people can recognize reasons but have the inability to apply them. Think of an addict is a common example of this. I think we should be very careful with these kinds of examples, but just for characterization's sake, you might think of an addict as someone who, at least sometimes, can recognize reasons not to use, but actually can't really help using. You might think that that's possible. That's the idea here, that you can recognize reasons and you can react to or apply those reasons. Okay, and having this reflective self-control, this ability to understand reasons and then apply them, that can tell us whether or not the person acted with ill will. Okay, and if we find out that this person here who knocked the glass over seemingly maliciously, if we find out that they don't really understand what they did was wrong, or maybe they did understand it, but they were under some like spell or on some drug or brainwashed, and so even though like kind of in their own mind they thought, oh gosh, I don't want to be doing this, but then they do it anyways, right? You need kind of both of these. You need this ability to recognize moral reasons for what you're doing, right? Reasons for or against what you're doing, and you need the ability to act in accordance with those reasons. Okay, and when you have that, that's sort of tells us about your quality of will. Right? This person did not act for moral reasons when they accidentally knocked your glass over. And that's why it doesn't express anything about their will, because they weren't acting from this mechanism that's tightly connected with your will. Right? So, sometimes people can't reflectively control themselves. They can't act from this ability to recognize and apply moral reasons. Sometimes it's temporary. It might be hypnotized, as I just said, intoxicated by some drug, brainwashed, whatever. And that's what Wallace means by excusing people. It doesn't fully exempt you. It's not like you're not a moral agent. You know, you go up on stage at the fair and you get hypnotized, and let's just pretend for a minute that that's real. And you get hypnotized, and then you do some weird thing. Let's say you punch someone, right? Well, you might say, well, that's not really your fault. It doesn't like express anything about you. You were under some hypnosis, and it doesn't reflect your ability to understand and apply moral reasons. It just reflects some hypnotic state you were in, right? And so we can excuse you for that, but if you go down off the stage and the hypnosis wears off, and then your friend makes fun of you for what you did on stage, and then you punch him, well, that's different, right? You're not excused anymore, because it's not like you're incapable of doing this stuff, recognizing reasons and so on. You just couldn't do it temporarily. And that's very different from what happens sometimes when people can't do it at all, like a child. Like a child, just by their nature, just doesn't have this ability yet, at least a really young child. Or someone who's disabled, especially severely cognitively disabled, right? Someone maybe who has an addiction or some other disorder. Those things, when you just don't have this ability at all, as opposed to it being kind of shut off for a minute, that is an exemption. You are exempt basically from the moral community in a way, or at least from some of its practices. Right? So the point of this is that this ability here to recognize and react to moral reasons is typically thought to not require alternative possibilities. Okay. That's Wallace's point. So he's like, look, when do we excuse people? I'm just going to do the recap now, and then we'll move on to the next section. It's like, look, it's not about determinism. He wanted to help Strawson's view by saying, let's look more closely at our practices than Strawson did and figure out, does determinism actually play a role? When do we excuse people? It's like, no, it's not about that. It's not about determinism, right? We don't even really require the ability to do otherwise. Why is it not about determinism? Well, it's about the ability to choose what you're doing. That's what excuses people or not, is whether they did it on purpose, right? Whether they had good or ill will, whether they meant it, whether they chose it. Well, in what kind of a way? Well, with this capacity to recognize and respond to reasons. Right? That's what does it. This ability, though, does not require alternative possibilities. It's just about being able to see reasons for what they are, being able to see, for instance, the fact that what you are going to do will hurt an innocent person. To be able to see that fact, not just see that fact, but see that fact as a reason to not do that thing. Right? If you don't just see that it's going to hurt them, you see that hurting them is not a reason, hurting them is a reason not to do that. Right? And then also, you can take that reason that you see and apply it to your action. You can act in light of that reason, or you can make a decision or choose in light of these moral reasons that you recognize. That's what the ability is about. And that, as we'll see in just a second, is supposed to not require alternative possibilities. And so this question is not, is determinism true? Right? Not, did they have the ability to do otherwise? No, the question, Wallace thinks, is, did they violate an obligation that's kind of founded in or justified by the moral community of which they're a part? Did they violate a moral obligation that it is reasonable for us to expect them to follow? When is it reasonable for us to expect them to follow it? Well, it's going to have something to do with their ability to recognize and respond to moral reasons. Okay. So it's not about the ability to do otherwise. It's about choosing in light of reasons. And then we just ask ourselves, this person here who knocks the glass over just because they don't like this person and they want to make them look stupid, let's say, did they violate a moral obligation? One, well, yeah, it seems like that was wrong. And was it a moral obligation that we can reasonably expect them to have recognized and followed? Okay. And Wallace thinks, well, that's what matters, and in order to figure out whether they could do that, we don't need to think about alternative possibilities. We just need to think about whether they have this capacity. So, this idea of having this capacity to recognize and react to moral reasons, we don't need alternative possibilities because this whole process could be determined. Okay, so you take some person who has some healthy, non-disordered, no crazy things, no neuroscientists, nothing going on, just ordinary person with healthy rational capacities. It could be that it was determined by the history or whatever. Could be that they were determined to grow up and be this way. But what's important is that because of their capacities, they can recognize moral reasons for and against their actions. Right? There might be reasons to do what they do. There might be reasons to not do what they're thinking about doing. And some of those reasons might be better and worse than others. And then they have this ability to look at all of them, deliberate, assess the reasons, so they recognize all that. And then they also have this ability of sort of practical rationality. They can take this reasoning and deliberation over the reasons and then turn it into an action with their will. And this whole process can be deterministic. It can be determined that you had this capacity, that you were such that you would have recognized this reason, or that you were determined to recognize this reason by the capacities you had, and then you were determined to take those reasons and then turn them into action in the way that you did. That could all be determined, and Wallace doesn't care. He doesn't think that matters. He doesn't think that matters because, again, it's not about whether you could have done otherwise. It's just about whether you have the capacity to recognize and respond to moral reasons. And if you do, then it's fair to hold you to the obligations that you have. Okay, we can say, look, John is not responsible for not picking up what's her name? Molly. Why? Not because he couldn't do otherwise. And not because he doesn't have this, but because he just didn't know. He wasn't even in a position to think about the moral reasons. Now, let's imagine that John told Molly he would pick her up, and then he just wanted to play a nasty joke on her and make her look dumb because, let's say, he's just feeling like a jerk today. I don't know. Just make it really simple. If he does that, if John has these rational capacities, like every sort of most normal human beings, then let's suppose it's true that he recognized that this was a bad thing to do. It was going to be, it's probably wrong, but I think it'll be really funny, and so I want to do it anyways, and it's going to make me feel good, and I'm kind of bumming on something else right now, and I just want to feel good at someone else's expense. He can recognize all these reasons, know what he's doing is really shitty, and then do it anyways. Ignore the reasons, just put his own gratification above these other reasons that he thinks about. Says, F it, I'm going to do it anyways. Well, he did have the ability to recognize it. So even if he was determined to do what he did because of the attitudes that he had, and maybe some of the character traits that he had, he still had the ability to see what he was doing was wrong, to deliberate about it, and then that still turned into his action to do it anyways. That's why he's not excused in that case. It's not because he was determined. It doesn't have anything to do with that. It doesn't matter if he had the ability to do otherwise. We can look at John and say, look, it's fair to hold him responsible because it's fair to expect him to follow the reasons. He saw the reasons and he thought, I'm just going to satisfy myself and do this nasty thing. Well, it's reasonable for us to say, dude, you shouldn't have done that. You should know better. You saw the reasons. It's not like you were drunk or something or whatever, brainwashed. You saw the reasons and you ignored them. And you valued your own gratification over these moral reasons. It's fair for us to hold him to that and expect him to respect moral reasons above his own selfish gratifications. And that's really what Wallace thinks it's about. Not just whether they violated an obligation. We need more than that. But we don't need the ability to do otherwise. What we need is, can we reasonably expect him to follow that? And what makes it reasonable? Well, it's really about having this capacity to grasp and apply moral reasons. Okay? All right. So, from these two, sort of not intertwined, but these two related views, what we get is the reactive attitudes theories. To be morally responsible, these two main tenets. To be morally responsible is just to be an appropriate target of the reactive attitudes. That's what it is. That's it. And again, to put it the way I put it above, to be responsible is to be appropriately held morally responsible. And this is just grounded in our ordinary human practices of holding each other responsible. Right? And then, to be an appropriate target of the reactive attitudes, therefore, because we're just grounding it in our practices, is independent of determinism. Determinism doesn't matter. And the determinism doesn't matter, in part at least, because the ability to do otherwise doesn't matter to our practices. Okay. Thus, these theories do reject PAP, right? They just like the Frankfurt style cases we saw last time, they do reject PAP. They think, you don't need the ability to do otherwise in order to be responsible. But it's from a clearly different sort of path. Okay. Now, with those on the table, what we're going to do is look at some criticisms of this view. Okay. Some of them, I think, just the first two. Yeah. Just the first two are the ones that Kane talks about, and I'll talk about two other ones just very briefly. So, you might ask, doesn't the ability to do otherwise actually matter to our practices? So, aren't they wrong about this? So they said it doesn't, but you might think, doesn't it actually matter to being appropriately held morally responsible? Well, Wallace is like, look, it's only about whether they choose to violate some obligation, and in particular, whether they choose with this capacity to recognize and respond to moral reasons, right? Wallace says, it's not about the ability to do otherwise. That's not when we excuse people. It's whether or not they choose in the light of moral reasons. And that's clearly compatible with determinism. Well, but whether they violated an obligation, whether we can say, hey, that person violated an obligation that they should have been following, well, whether we can say that depends on whether they could have fulfilled that obligation. whether they could have done otherwise. So Wallace tries to get the ability to do otherwise out of here by saying, nah, it's just about choosing in the light of moral reasons, right? And even if you're determined to have that capacity, you still can have that capacity and recognize reasons, even if you're determined to recognize them, right? You might recognize them sometimes and not other times, but every time you recognize them, you're determined. Every time you don't, you're determined. But still, people have different capacities to recognize and respond to moral reasons. And so it's on that basis that we make distinctions about who is and isn't responsible and who's responsible to greater and lesser degrees based on the different capacities. But Kane's point here is, you might think, doesn't like whether or not we think that their capacity should have been in play, in other words, whether or not they actually violated an obligation, or whether or not an obligation was actually applied to this person, depends on whether they could have done otherwise. Why? Well, there's this principle that's called odd implies can. And it goes like this. If S ought to do A, if someone ought to do some action, if that's true, then it also has to be true that that person has the ability to do that action. And we can put this negatively too. If someone ought not to do some action, or if someone ought to not do some action, right? If they ought to refrain from doing A, then they have to have the ability to not do that action. Okay? So the point is, you can't be obligated to do stuff that you don't have the ability to do. And you can't be obligated to not do stuff, right? You can't be restricted from doing stuff that you can't actually not do, right? If you say, hey, you have an obligation, there's someone starving on the moon right now. And because we have an obligation to help people, you have an obligation to make your way to the moon right now and go help them. Well, I can't make my way to the moon right now. First of all, I can't jump to the moon. I also don't have money to get to the moon. I don't have the training to get to the moon. All these different kinds of things. I can't get to the moon. Now let's just imagine, let's just make it a little more extreme and say, let's just imagine it's literally impossible for me to get to the moon. Well, then I can't be obligated to go to the moon and help this person. Right? What if the only way I could get there was by jumping? Well, I can't jump to the moon, right? So I can't be obligated to do things that I can't do. And I can't be obligated to not do things that I can't help but do. That is called odd implies can. And that's important because Wallace thinks, well, it's not about the ability to do otherwise. It's just about whether someone has this capacity. And then if they have that capacity, then it's reasonable to expect them to follow certain obligations. Well, it's only reasonable to hold people to obligations if they actually have the ability to fulfill them. And so now it seems like the ability to do otherwise comes in. And the justification is back to fairness. It's the same justification for thinking that people have to be free in order to be responsible. Excuse me. The justification is it's unfair to make me obligated to do something that I literally can't do. That's not really fair, right? And morality is supposed to be fair. So being morally responsible depends on being an appropriate target of the reactive attitudes. And Wallace says being an appropriate target of the reactive attitudes depends on whether someone violated some obligation. Or really whether it's appropriate to say that they have violated some obligation, and whether that's appropriate depends on them having this capacity and whether the obligation applies to them and everything. Well, whether they violated some obligation depends on whether they could have fulfilled it. Because if they couldn't have fulfilled it, then they didn't have that obligation. Because if someone ought to do something, then they have the ability to do it, right? So if we say, well, John violated an obligation when he failed to pick up Molly. Well, if he was obligated to pick up Molly, then that means he could have picked up Molly. Well, if determinism is true, he doesn't have alternative possibilities. He's just going to do whatever he's determined to do. So if he's determined to be a jerk and not pick up Molly, even if it's coming from a jerk place, if he's determined, then he doesn't have the ability to pick her up. And then given this principle, it seems like he can't be obligated to pick her up because he can't fulfill that request. Right? So the point is, moral responsibility looks like ends up coming back to the ability to do otherwise. And importantly, it seems like this kind of reasoning is right in line with the way we think about responsibility in our practices. And so we're not like going far afield from what Strawson and Wallace want. Okay. Now, Wallace might try to say, well, look, this ability, whether we say John has the ability to pick her up, is still not about global determinism. It's still not about the ability to do otherwise. What it's really about is having these capacities. This capacity. Right? What it's really about is whether he could have, in certain situations, in general, you might say, whether he has the general capacity to respond to reasons. Right? Maybe in this situation, because determinism is true, he recognized that his nasty prank was bad, but he wanted to do it anyways. But what is his general capacity? Typically, he responds to moral reasons and recognizes them and so on. If we think that, then now we're getting at some general capacity, and then now maybe it's still true to say that he could have. I mean, like he could have. Look, he knows what's going on. He knows moral reasons. He's not like crazy, right? And if you remember from one of our previous chapters from Kane, there was this like bad waiter example where this waiter always like kind of just treats people like, not treats them like crap, but just doesn't really care about people, and he like kind of half-asses it on all of his tables, and just gives people like the bare minimum service. But then every time his friends and parents and family come in, and maybe like the restaurant owner, he just like is the cheeriest person and does like really great service and is like hustling around. And you might think, well, now we just suppose determinism is true. Some people want to say the appropriate way to describe this is to say he does have the ability to treat the other people well, to treat his ordinary customers well. Look, we can see that he does. We can see him every day coming in with other people. Maybe he does it like randomly, or people that he thinks are attractive. Like, we see that he has the ability to treat customers well. He's just not doing it for most of them. He's just doing it for the ones that he likes. So this idea, and then what that means is like the ability to do otherwise might not be about like literally in the moment could you have another option. It's more about what are your general capacities. That's what Wallace might try to say. Okay. But then there's another objection. Kane says, well, then at this point another objection comes in. If you think it's just about acting from certain capacities, even if you're determined to do so, we might ask the other Strawson question, not Peter Strawson, but the Galen Strawson question. Did you make yourself with those capacities? If those capacities are determining what you do at every moment, right? You treat these customers in this way because you were determined to treat those people in that way at that moment, and then you treat other people in a different way because you were determined to treat those people in that different way at that different moment. All of that's determined, but that means it's just a result of the way you are and the laws of nature. Well, you're obviously not responsible for the laws of nature, but are you responsible for the way you are? Right? If Wallace just wants it to make it about capacities, like, well, to say that John had the ability to pick Molly up, Wallace wants to say, well, that just means in general he has this reasoning ability and he understands moral reasons, and like he could have, right? He's picked up a bunch of people before and not played that trick. I was like, yeah, but did he is like he responsible for the way he is that made him perform that action like that? And remember manipulation, right? Like, it's not just the universe making you the way you are. What if someone was manipulated into being a certain way? Remember Frankenstein's monster? He wakes up. He's just created with this character to act in certain ways. And that character, let's imagine, just determines what he does. Well, he's not responsible for that character. And that character is making him do what he does. Right? And the same for someone who's manipulated. Same for someone who just has a character that was given to them by the universe that determines them to do what they do. They're not responsible for that. If you're not responsible for for the thing that makes you do what you do, how could you be responsible for what you do? That's a question. Okay. Foreknowledge here matters. So Judas betrays Jesus to the Romans, and you might ask, on first glance, you're like, well, Judas is not a mentally ill person. He's not brainwashed or anything like that. He's an ordinary person with ordinary capacities, and he just decided that, for his own self-protection and gratification, that he was going to betray his friend, Jesus. Now, then you might wonder, and it seems like, okay, maybe he's responsible. But then you might wonder, why is he a betraying kind of person? Why did he decide it was a good idea to betray Jesus and satisfy his own, or protect himself? Why? And if you say, well, here's the answer. I'm not saying this is true. I'm just saying, if you thought that the answer was, well, God made him do that. It was God's plan that Judas was going to betray Jesus, right? And it wasn't ever going to be any different. God preordained it. It's just part of the path to creating salvation for everyone. So there you go. And he was never going to be able to do otherwise. Well, then you might think, how could we blame him? I mean, of course, the action came from his character that he was given, and it came from his ordinary rational capacities that he was given by God. But all of this is just part of him being determined to betray Jesus on that day. Well, twice, I guess. But if that's true, you might ask, how's it fair to blame someone like that? It was impossible for him to avoid doing that thing. Literally impossible. So how is that fair to blame him? Okay. Not only was it impossible for him to avoid, but what you couldn't avoid was done because of a character or because of capacities that you had that it was impossible to avoid having. You were determined to have the capacities, and then those capacities determined you to do what you did. So you couldn't avoid it anything. How is that fair? And if we believe Paraboom and Todd, manipulation, predestination, these things are just no different than determinism. Now, someone might resist that, right? So what Wallace says is, what Kane says on behalf of Wallace is, Wallace might say, well, look, what you're saying, going back to the general capacity stuff, it's like you're talking about this really technical notion of literally not being able to do otherwise when you say he doesn't have the ability to avoid it. He doesn't have the ability to avoid his betraying action. Well, Wallace says, what you mean there when you say he doesn't have the ability, you're using a notion of ability that's too technical and esoteric. What we should be really thinking about is this more general ability. Basically, what does Judas do sort of across his whole life? Like, what's his kind of general pattern of being able to recognize and respond to reasons? And if he does have a general capacity to do that, then that's really what matters. And so when he acts from that capacity in particular situations, might be true that he couldn't have done otherwise, but that's not really the question. The important question is, did he act from a general capacity? Did he act in a way that reflects the fact that, ordinarily speaking, he could do different kinds of things? He can respond to reasons, he can understand that and all that. That's really what matters. Okay. Well, this is like, these are the important questions. Is he ignorant? No. Is he confused? No. Is he cognitively disabled? No. Is he a child? Obviously not. Is he brainwashed? Not really. I mean, it depends on what you want to say about God preordaining him, but not ordinarily speaking. No, he's not, right? So those, and that's kind of the important point here, is that it's ordinarily speaking that matters for Wallace and Strawson, Peter Strawson. What matters is our ordinary practices, our ordinary understanding of how we blame. Our ordinary understanding and practices about how we blame people, when we excuse them, and we just don't ask these really global questions like that. That's just not natural. It's not even needed for us to have this sort of moral community of blaming each other and holding each other to account. We don't need that stuff. Right? What we ordinarily mean by capacity is just, hey, do they generally have the ability to recognize reasons and respond to them, right? This view is grounded in practice, okay? And our practices don't have a everyone gets out of jail free card. No one's responsible because of determinism. That's just not a part of our practices. Okay? That's the response. I should say, I forgot, I didn't put this in here, but you could reject this principle too. That's another way to respond to this objection. Because remember, this objection that really the ability to do otherwise is kind of coming in at the end. Its responsibility is about appropriate reactive attitudes, which is about whether or not it's reasonable to say that someone violated an obligation in the moral community. Well, whether it's reasonable to say that depends on whether they could have fulfilled it, because we appeal to this principle. Well, you could reject ought implies can. Some people do that. Some people think that you could be obligated to do something even if you can't do it. And we won't get into that really, but that is also a literature where people debate back and forth. I would say I don't know this literature super well, but I would say that accepting this principle is the sort of more popular view, the more common view, at least like sort of statistically speaking anyways, because this view is very intuitive, and that intuitive views tend to be very popular until they're shown to be wrong successfully. Not that this hasn't successfully been shown to be wrong, it's just people tend to like to hold on to their intuitions, and then when arguments against this come up, philosophers come up with clever responses to them. So the point of that is just to say lots of people accept this principle, but not everyone. Some people reject this principle. So one way to respond to this would be to try to reject this principle, and then that would help do away with this objection. And I'll just mention Alexandra King, who was a professor at the university that I went to, at University of Buffalo. I think she's somewhere else now. I'm trying to remember where she went, but I think Simon Fraser University maybe. And she's written a bunch. She did her dissertation on ought implies can, and she's written some papers on it. And I believe she's recently come out with a book on ought implies can, where she argues against this principle. And so if you're interested in sort of extracurricular kinds of things, you can look up Alex King and her work on ought implies can. Okay, moving on. So manipulation and so forth might become a problem even if we get past this. Can you be manipulated? Even if you think you can be obligated to do something that you can't do, well, if it's kind of going back to the Wallace and Strawson view, if it's just about having certain capacities, well, the Wallace view in particular, then can't you be sort of manipulated to have those capacities, right? The intuition at the end sort of comes in, right? If you literally can't exercise your capacities in some situation, so Wallace wants to say, it's about this general capacity, right? In the moment, it doesn't matter if you're determined and you can't do otherwise. We can still say, well, in general, you can recognize reasons, and so we'll hold you responsible now when you ignored the reasons, even though you were determined to ignore the reasons and do the selfish thing or whatever. But in general, you're able to not do the selfish thing, at least a lot of the time. And so you have this general capacity to do the right thing and respond to the moral reasons. So we'll hold you responsible now. Well, one question you might think of is, if fairness matters, and it does seem like it matters to them, then how could it be fair to blame someone for something when they literally couldn't, to blame someone for doing something because of the capacities that they have? Right? You're like, well, you have the capacity to respond to reasons and to do to not do that kind of thing. Well, it's like, yeah, but you're saying in this situation, it's possible that I literally couldn't have helped it. Like, why does it matter that I have some general capacity to do things in other situations? Like, I'm being blamed for what I just did right now. And you're saying literally, it's possible that literally I couldn't have done anything else. So why do you care that I could have done something else in another situation? You might think, like, I don't get it. That doesn't have anything to do with what I just did right now. So the intuition, like, how is that fair? And so you might think about how a Straussonian or a Wallace defender, or Wallace himself, would respond to this. Because that might be a worry that comes up at the end. Okay, so 2 objections that Kane doesn't talk about, and then we'll be done. We can do semi-compatibilism. All right, so does the order reversal make this view susceptible to cultural relativism? So the order reversal was, remember, ordinarily being appropriately held morally responsible is determined by whether you're responsible. Whether it's okay to hold someone responsible is determined by whether they are responsible. But Strawson says being, whether they are responsible, is determined by whether we can appropriately hold them responsible. And so flipping that on its head, what if our practices deemed it appropriate to do things that we don't think are very nice right now? What if someday down the road our moral responsibility practices of humans turned out that, we could hold children responsible or hold the severely cognitively disabled responsible? Well, Strawson's reply basically seems to be that we never would do that. He's like, nah, that's psychologically impossible. It's just not what we would do. We wouldn't have those kinds of practices. That's why we don't right now. But again, he didn't really do a ton of work doing like the actual, I guess you would say, anthropological or sociological or historical work here. There's societies not that long ago and not that obscure, like Western societies, even like states in the United States, I think, where people put animals on trial. Like dogs and goats and cows and shit. Like, held animals to court, like literally. And so, that is clearly not a part of our responsibility practices anymore. I guess you might say, well, we still, like, go kill a animal, like a wolf or something that is rabid and hurts people, or like a bear that is kind of terrorizing an area. We certainly do this, but note 2 things. One, we don't have to hold the animal responsible in order to do that. That seems more like a consequentialist thing. We're worried about it killing more people, so we just kill it because it seems dangerous. Secondly, most people hear about that. A lot of people, anyways, hear about that, and they're horrified by that. Like, why? It's not the animals, especially the victim, usually, right? The victim's like, why did they kill it? It's just being an animal. That's just what they do. And so it's not clear that our moral responsibility practices would even endorse that anyways. But the point is just, what about other cultures, right? What about other cultures? What's the evidence that we wouldn't drastically change our responsibility practices into making it appropriate to hold people responsible for things that now we would never do, or we would think that was crazy, right? If our practice allows it, it seems like that makes the person responsible. If the practice allows you to appropriately hold someone responsible for something, then that's what makes them responsible. And so all you need is just for our practices to be really counterintuitive, and then you get a problem. You get kind of a cultural relativism objection here. Okay, now there's a reasonableness standard objection too. So Wallace appeals to this reasonableness standard. He says, being responsible depends on whether someone violated an obligation, but whether that obligation applied to that person is up to whether we think that's reasonable, right? Is it reasonable for us to expect that person to fulfill that obligation? Is it reasonable enough? Is it reasonable for us to hold that person to this obligation? And then we can ask whether they violated it. But at first it needs to be reasonable that the obligation applies to them, right? Well, how do we know when it's reasonable to expect the person to fulfill the obligation? Or how do we know when it's reasonable to hold someone to an obligation? You might think determining when an obligation applies to someone so that we can know if they violated it and therefore whether they're responsible might just already depend on knowing when people are responsible. So it kind of work like this. So you'd have someone, like 2 cases where someone seems like they're responsible in one case and not in the other case. He's like, well, in the case where that seems like they're responsible, it's because it seems reasonable to think that the obligation applies. And in the other case, where they're not responsible, it's because it's not really reasonable to say that they, should have avoided that thing because they didn't really know about this obligation or whatever, and it's not reasonable to hold them to it. Therefore, they didn't really violate anything. The kind of objection here is supposed to say, how do you know? How do you know your intuitions are right about these two cases? It seems like you already have intuitions about the people being responsible or not. Excuse me. And then you use those intuitions to decide when it's reasonable. So how do we know when it's reasonable? We might have to sneak in intuitions about when people are responsible. But the reasonableness stuff was supposed to tell us when people are responsible. And so that's a worry. Okay, I just throw that worry out there. I'm not going to worry about it too much. Okay, now at the end. Now, Wallace and Strawson kind of give us this way of thinking about responsibility where we just don't care about determinism, right? We have enough control, we have enough principles for when people can be held responsible, even if determinism is true, because we just look to our practices, right? We just look to our practices, and that should do it, right? Well, this says that free will and moral responsibility are both compatible with determinism, but people really kind of want to keep free will connected to the ability to do otherwise. You remember Peter Van Inwagen last week when I said a lot of people define free will as just the control needed for responsibility? Well, Peter Van Inwagen denied that, right? He said, no, free will is just about this ability to do otherwise. It's about the power at one time to do A or to do not A. Okay, you have the power to do either one of those, not both at the same time, but to do either one. And that seems to entail alternative possibilities in determinism. And so, if free will is tightly connected to the ability to do otherwise, then we have a problem with the above accounts. Well, Fisher has this view called semi-compatibilism. I briefly mentioned it last time. Kane talks about it in this chapter, so I'll go through it just quickly. Semi-compatibilism says it's like half compatibilism. Responsibility is compatible with determinism, but free will isn't, or might not be, whatever. Even if free will is not, responsibility is. So, Fisher, according to Kane, this is unclear. I don't know. I've talked to Fisher more recently than this book was written, and it's not really clear. But Fisher finds the consequence argument powerful. So I say powerful because it's not really clear. Kane thinks that he endorses it, but he at least finds it powerful. And the consequence argument shows that, or is supposed to show that free will requires the ability to do otherwise. But Fisher certainly thinks that the Frankfurt cases succeed. I mean, he gives his own version of them. So he thinks moral responsibility doesn't require to do otherwise, right? Fisher denies PAP. And so because of that, it seems like Fisher has this view where at least possibly free will requires the ability to do otherwise, but moral responsibility doesn't. And therefore, moral responsibility would not be eliminated by determinism, even if free will was. And so that's semi-compatibilism. Now, semi-compatibilism kind of gets connected with Fisher's view of reason's responsiveness. So remember that most people think moral responsibility requires free will, right? It's just free will is just responsibility level control. But if Fisher's saying free will does not is not consistent with determinism, so free will is the ability to do otherwise, right? Then moral responsibility can't require that because moral responsibility is compatible with determinism, but free will is not. And so semi-compatibilism rejects the view that moral responsibility requires free will, understood as the ability to do otherwise. Okay. Therefore, we need something else. Now, if you remember from last time in the diagram where I had all the concepts resting on each other, if you disconnect free will and responsibility, if you disconnect responsibility from the ability to do otherwise, like Fisher does, okay, if you disconnect those, with Frankfurt cases, then you don't lose freedom and responsibility by determinism, but you need to ground responsibility in something else if it's not the ability to do otherwise. Okay. What is the control that we need in order to get responsibility? What's control without the ability to do otherwise, right? And Fisher's answer is called guidance control. And guidance control involves what he calls reasons responsiveness. And we'll get into the nitty-gritty details. Really, it's the appropriate version is moderate reasons responsiveness, but we won't talk about that. But this is when an action is caused by a mechanism, a psychological mechanism. So you have some mechanism of deliberation and thinking about reasons. It's very much like this. It's very much like Wallace's capacity for recognizing and responding to reasons. And Fisher developed it in much, much more detail. So when an action is caused by that kind of capacity or mechanism, right? And when that mechanism is sufficiently sensitive to reasons. So let's try to give you an example with this. So say the green here is the actual world. This is the actual world. You have this person S, and they do this action phi. I use this diagram in a philosophy paper, and so sorry, it's looks a little bit kind of technical, but phi is just an action, any action. So S does phi in the actual world. Okay, world actual. And now there's all these different possibilities, right? So in order to see whether someone is reasons responsive, right, whether they have this general capacity for being sensitive to the moral reasons, what we do is we just imagine them in a different world. Imagine them in a different scenario, but a scenario that's very relevantly similar. Okay, so they do S does phi in some scenarios. Let's say they decide to drink at a party. Okay, now you look at another possible world where you have a very similar situation. S is at a party deciding whether they want to drink, but then you add some other set of reasons not to phi. Okay, maybe you say they're deciding whether to drink, but in this case, nobody calls or anything. They're just deciding whether to drink, and then they just do it. They drink because they think, it's not going to hurt anybody or whatever else, and they decide to drink. In this scenario, let's say their mom calls them and says, "Hey, please don't drink. It's going to upset me so much if you drink. I'm just really worried about you. Don't drink, whatever." And you might think, that's a really good reason not to drink. You don't want to disobey your parent. You don't want to upset them. And let's pretend that you think like there's no way for you to hide it. Maybe your sibling is there too, and they're going to tell if you do. So to see whether this person is responsible, or to see whether this person is reasons responsive, I should say, we see, can they respond to other reasons not to do what they did? If there were reasons to refrain from phying, would they respond to them? And in this diagram, we go to this other world, and if it's green, that means they recognized it. They recognize the reason not to do what they did, and then they don't do that thing for that reason. Okay. And in this case, it's a little different. It's green, so that means they recognize some reason not to do phi, but they did phi anyways. So they recognize the reason, their mom calls, and they're like, "Oh, gosh, man, it would probably be bad for me to drink now." And they say, "F it," and they drink anyways. Right? And then the red means that there are reasons for them not to do it, but they don't recognize those reasons. They're not sensitive to the moral reasons. And so they do it anyways, right? They phi anyways. And then you might have other worlds where there's different reasons. So basically what you do is you have a person who does something, and you say, okay, with their deliberation process, with their deliberative mechanism, if we put them in a very similar situation, in different kinds, like all the possible different ways that they could have been in that situation, and then we just give them a bunch of different reasons not to do that thing, how would they have reacted? Would they even recognize the reason, green? Or would they not even recognize that reason, red? And then if they recognize it, would they respond and not do that, right? Recognizes it, respond, doesn't do it. Or would they recognize it but still do it anyways? So you think of like an addict who can recognize a bunch of reasons, but still isn't able to respond to them. And so that means they're not very reasons responsive, because you both have to recognize reasons and respond to them. So we won't get into too much detail, but chapter 9, I think, in Kane's book talks about this a little bit more. But Fisher's view then is that you can be responsible even if you're not free in the sense of the ability to do otherwise, because you can exercise guidance control. You can act from a mechanism, you can act from this capacity to generally recognize and respond to reasons. And that's all it takes. It doesn't matter if you couldn't have done otherwise. It just matters if your action came from this general capacity to be sensitive to the reasons. That's what he thinks. Okay. Now we have another question. What about manipulation? Right? So Fisher's view, predetermination, all this stuff. So Fisher's view requires that the agent take ownership, right? You might think, well, can't you be manipulated into being reasons responsive? And that's what Pereboom's four-case manipulation tried to show, that the person in Pereboom's manipulation case was actually reasons responsive, yet we might think that they're still not responsible. Well, Fisher says, look, no, you don't just have to have this capacity to be sensitive to reasons, because yeah, sure, someone could implant that capacity in you, right? But you also have to take ownership of the reasons responsive capacity mechanism, right? You have to see yourself as an appropriate target, right? And determinism doesn't necessarily undermine that, right? Because you can still endorse your mechanism. You can be determined to have it, but then you can recognize, like, say, no, I think I'm pretty good at recognizing reasons. And yeah, and you can like start to develop your capacity. So taking ownership of your reasons responsive mechanism, taking ownership of your ability to deliberate, and seeing yourself as this deliberative agent who people might react to with the reactive attitudes, that is also required. And if you just have manipulation, God does something to make you a certain way, especially in the manipulation cases that are direct, immediate manipulation, where you're being controlled by like a remote control, it's not really clear that you're taking ownership. It's really like you have just another agent sort of controlling you, right? But determinism's not necessarily like that. It's not another agent, right? But we still have this question. Can't we be manipulated or determined to take ownership? Right? And so if taking ownership is supposed to be able to is supposed to be this feature that like brings in this sort of authorship or control, well, can't you just be determined or manipulated into taking ownership? Like you might think, I don't get why that question just doesn't get pushed back to the ownership. Like we're wondering whether you can be responsible, and we're wondering about the action that you performed, and we're like, well, you couldn't have done anything else. And Fisher's like, oh, no, that's okay. It doesn't matter if you couldn't have performed another action, as long as your action was caused by this mechanism that's sensitive to the reasons. That's really all we care about. Because then that means, you're a responsible agent, and you really generally have this ability to do the right thing when there's reasons and all that. And then we say, oh, yeah, but what about, like, manipulation? And he's like, well, you have to be able to take ownership of your mechanism, too, right? And that's not necessarily going to be the case in manipulation. You have to recognize yourself as a moral agent and take responsibility for your mechanism. Then, once that mechanism is your own, then when it causes you to act, now, okay, that's even better, right? And then we say, wait a minute. Wait, doesn't all the free will and responsibility questions, don't those just get pushed back to the ownership action? So now instead of asking whether your action was free and responsible, why don't we just ask whether your taking ownership was free and responsible, right? Why? Yeah, I mean, is there a regress? Now we're going to have the authorship of authorship. We have a kind of Frankfurt regress here. Maybe. You might think there's a way out of this, and that would be interesting to see in a paper. Okay, so some takeaways. Notice what Strawson does and how his approach is different. Okay, It's not about these metaphysical, crazy, philosophical worries about determinism. What's the ultimate foundation? Our practices. What are reactive attitudes? How do those play a role? Right? Not just what are examples like indignation and resentment and gratitude. What is this idea of a reactive attitude? This responding to people, right? And what roles does it play in our practices that ultimately ground our responsibility, right? And then think about this order reversal, because that's really sort of important to understanding what he's doing here. Right? Being responsible ends up just being about appropriately holding people responsible. And you say, what determines that? Well, your practice. Well, why? Well, because that practice is natural. It fulfills fundamental needs. Right? And then when we look to the practices, how does that make determinism irrelevant? Think about that stuff. And what does Strawson do to help? Right? Well, he comes in and starts talking about excuses. Right? He like basically takes the Strawson view and is like, okay, let's really see if determinism can fit into our practices. Do we use determinism? Do we think about that in our practices? If Strawson wants to say it's all determined by how our practices go, does determinism have a role there? Right? The reactive attitudes, and then think about what he says no, right? No, it doesn't. But what does he think matters for excusing or exempting people? Right? Whether or not we could reasonably hold them to certain obligations, and whether their action came from a general capacity to recognize and respond to reasons. Okay. And then reactive attitudes are taken up in response to people's quality of will. Their actions express some quality of will. Ill will, goodwill, or just the absence of ill will, or maybe the absence of goodwill where it should have been there, right? And that's what reactive attitudes are targeting. Okay. And then, as I just mentioned, Wallace has this really special role for choice. It's not about ability to do otherwise. It's about whether you chose based on some reflective self-control and whether the obligations applied to you. These are the reasons that we care about. These are the reasons we excuse people or blame people, not determinism. Okay. Think about why this capacity for reflective self-control doesn't require the ability to do otherwise. And then think, maybe it does. Does it? Is odd implies can true? Okay. Think about the criticisms to Strawson's theory, right? Does the ability to do otherwise really not matter? Well, odd implies can. Can we reasonably require that someone meet an obligation when literally they couldn't fulfill that obligation? It was impossible for them to do it, but we still apply it to them? Should we accept odd implies can? And what about manipulation? Is it fair to blame Judas if God preordained him from the beginning of time to betray Jesus that day in exactly the way that he did, where it was impossible for him to do anything different? And it was impossible for him to give himself a different kind of character that would have chosen different? Is that fair? Is cultural relativism really avoided? If we're grounding responsibility in our human practices, I mean, how common are all the different human practices of holding people responsible? Are there really some universal, fundamental, underlying rules? And moreover, can those change over time? And our practices look really, really different than they do now? Who knows? Does appealing to when it's reasonable to hold someone morally responsible, when it's reasonable to think the obligations apply to them, do we already have to know when people are and aren't responsible in order to say what's reasonable or not? That's a question you might ask. Okay, now consider, think about semi-compatibilism, right? And why is this approach kind of a middle path? Strawsonian responsibility is supposed to get rid of free will. Strawsonian moral responsibility is supposed to get rid of determinism, the worry about determinism, right? But semi-compatibilism offers us a way to keep moral responsibility without alternative possibilities, but be able to get rid of worrying about free will, right? Because some people say, well, don't get rid of alternative possibilities for free will. And Fisher's offering a way to do that. You don't have to say free will doesn't require alternative possibilities, even though you say moral responsibility doesn't require alternative possibilities. Right? But if you think moral responsibility doesn't require alternative possibilities and therefore free will, if you're a semi-compatibilist, what sort of control can we have that would allow responsibility but without having alternative possibilities? And Fisher and Wallace, Strawson, a number of other people basically say it's about being caused by the right kind of capacities. It's about being caused by the right kinds of thing, by the right kind of feature of you. Some people say capacities, like Wallace and Fisher. Some people say the right kinds of mental states, like Frankfurt and other structuralists, hierarchical theorists. Some people say it's about being caused by the right kind of desire, like Nomi Arpali and Tim Schroeder. So being caused by the right thing is compatible with determinism. Determinism is just about causation leading to only to one future. But as long as the right thing causes you, it doesn't matter if you have options. It's not about having an open future. It's about the right thing causing you. And as long as the right kinds of capacities cause you, then you can be morally responsible. That's the view. That's the view anyways. And now we have to say, does this really avoid the manipulation and fairness worries? If you really can't do otherwise, is being caused by some deliberative capacity that you didn't choose, is that enough? Is that fair? And does this really get around manipulation? Questions to think about. All right. Thanks.